What's a news story that got buried that you think more people need to hear? Story 1. UK Post Office Scandal. Over a decade, hundreds of sub-postmasters were sacked, prosecuted, bankrupted, and even jailed for supposedly stealing from their own businesses. Turns out the post office had installed a shoddy accounting software which was randomly throwing out incorrect transactions. The post office has behaved abominably from beginning to end, spending millions dragging the case through the courts in the hope that the claimants would run out of funds. Even today, decades later, the compensation scheme has become a scandal within a scandal, with some claimants who lost hundreds of thousands being offered only a few grand in compensation, others having their claims gobbled up by bankruptcy fees. Story 2. An oil well in the Gulf of Mexico, off of the coast of Louisiana, that's just been leaking ridiculous amounts of oil for over a decade now, and last I know, nobody's doing shit about it. The Taylor platform or something like that. It was owned by a retired couple who just passed the buck and moved on or died. Can't remember. It's estimated that it spilled more oil over time than the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Story 3. There was a scandal in Germany in the 70s and 80s where the pharma industry used contaminated blood products to make a medicine for people who got hemophilia so they didn't spend too much money on making the medicine. Hemophilia means that you have no blood clotting, and it's not that common. Well, the contaminated medicine gave around 4,500 hemophilic persons HIV and/or hepatitis C. Story 4. This is Cherokee Nation news, but back in 2018, our hospital asked over 180 patients to come back for blood-borne pathogen testing. At first, the hospital and CN claimed it was due to an HVAC mishap, and then came out that a nurse was reusing needles and not disposing of medication like fentanyl properly. Even after the investigation, in which our own health system lied to patients and tried to cover the tracks of a nurse training reviews varied wildly, and he got to keep his nursing license after leaving the hospital for a different local one. Oh, and he was the chief's son at the time. Story 5. 3 years ago, I was eating Hot Pockets and cut my gum on something sharp. Apparently, in 2021, about 600,000 Hot Pockets somehow got mixed up with some shards of glass. Apparently, some people were seriously injured. Story 6. This is actually pretty recent, yet no one talks about it. Larry Page, the co-founder of Google, has gone missing. Nobody knows where he is. The U.S. Virgin Islands are trying to find him to subpoena him due to his involvement with I scrolled so far on this thread, and there isn't a single mention of him. Story 7. German child psychologist Helmut Kindler built up a distribution network for pedophiles in the 60s in Germany. He conducted an experiment in which he distributed children for adoption to pedophiles and even took in at least one child himself. Apparently, some children tried to get help, but a lot of the politicians, high-ranking police officers, and judges were part of the experiment and silenced them. Nobody ever went to prison for that. They only started investigating in 2015, and the full report of it was published in 2022. Funnily enough, it's not even widely known in Germany, so I doubt it's known internationally. Story 8. The guy in Nova Scotia, Canada, who dressed up as a policeman, customized his vehicle to look like a police car and was pulling people over and murdering them. There should be protocols in place to prevent this from happening again. Story 9. The post office scandal in the UK. Long story short, in 1999, the post office brought in a new computer system, run by Fujitsu, which they rolled out across the entire country. Shortly afterward, individual postmasters, people who run local post offices, began to notice shortfalls in their accounting totals. The post office investigated these cases in isolation and decided the postmasters were stealing money. In reality, these shortfalls were caused by a bug in the Fujitsu software. However, the post office and Fujitsu swept this under the rug, despite receiving reports from independent investigators that the software was to blame. Instead of fixing the software, the post office decided to take their own postmasters to court on fraud charges. It's worth noting that the postmasters are effectively like franchise managers for the post office, and are made up largely of nice, unassuming older people who want to run a community service as they wind down towards retirement. You would think that after 4 or 5 of these civil servants with no criminal history were all separately accused of stealing huge sums of money, the post office might wonder if something else was to blame. Nope. Over the next 15 years, the post office prosecuted a frankly incredible 736 of their own postmasters, roughly one every single week. Hundreds more were suspended. In total, thousands were probably affected. These people lost their jobs and often went to prison. They were told they had to pay back thousands of pounds they had supposedly stolen. Some killed themselves from the stress. Many of them kept working until old age and died in debt. It took a class action lawsuit in 2021 for anyone to admit that they were innocent. There is a paper trail showing that executives in the post office and Fujitsu knew of the problems with the software even as it was being developed. Story 10. I remember the day when the vice president of Monsanto, Michael R. Taylor, became the deputy commissioner of the FDA. Why do I remember this? Every news station was screaming about gay marriage, and this little poisoned VP transferred to being in charge of our food supply without the barest whisper. It may not be current news, but by all means, that story was buried. It's almost like all of this empty culture war bullshit is designed specifically for this sort of governance strategy. Story 11. 10,000 pounds of highly explosive ammonium nitrate disappeared from a rail car last week. That's what they used in Oklahoma City. From the article, the company said the rail car with the material was sealed when it left a manufacturing site in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the seals were still intact when it arrived in Saltdale, California. The initial assessment is that a leak through the bottom gate on the rail car may have developed in transit, the statement said. The company said it does not suspect any criminal or malicious activity was involved in the disappearance of the cargo. Story 12. The leader of Putin's political opposition party was recently sentenced to 25+ years for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Kara-Murza's imprisonment essentially removed the only official second option in Russia's political system. Effectively, Putin is no longer hiding behind a papier-mâché democracy and has stepped out as an overtly oppressive dictator. The political opposition has previously been allowed to speak semi-candidly as a way for Russia to maintain its technical status as a democratic republic with competing political parties. Kara-Murza's closing statement at his trial in the Moscow City Court was bone-chilling. Members of the court, I was sure after 2 decades spent in Russian politics, after all that I have seen and experienced, that nothing can surprise me anymore. I must admit that I was wrong. I've been surprised by the extent to which my trial, in its secrecy and its contempt for legal norms, has surpassed even the trials of Soviet dissidents in the 1960s and 70s. And that's not even to mention the harshness of the sentence requested by the prosecution or the talk of enemies of the state. In this respect, we've gone beyond the 1970s, all the way back to the 1930s. For me, as an historian, this is an occasion for reflection. At one point during my testimony, the presiding judge reminded me that one of the extenuating circumstances was remorse for what the accused has done. And although there is little that's amusing about my present situation, I could not help smiling. The criminal, of course, must repent of his deeds. I'm in jail for my political views, for speaking out against the war in Ukraine, for many years of struggle against Vladimir Putin's dictatorship, for facilitating the adoption of personal international sanctions under the Magnitsky Act against human rights violators. Not only do I not repent of any of this, I am proud of it. I am proud that Boris Nemtsov brought me into politics, and I hope that he is not ashamed of me. I subscribe to every word that I have spoken and every word of which I have been accused by this court. I blame myself for only one thing, that over the years of my political activity, I have not managed to convince enough of my compatriots and enough politicians in the democratic countries of the danger that the current regime in the Kremlin poses for Russia and for the world. Today, this is obvious to everyone, but at a terrible price, the price of war. In their last statements to the court, defendants usually ask for an acquittal. For a person who has not committed any crimes, acquittal would be the only fair verdict, but I do not ask this court for anything. I know the verdict. I knew it a year ago when I saw people in black uniforms and black masks running after my car in the rearview mirror. Such is the price for speaking up in Russia today. But I also know that the day will come when the darkness over our country will dissipate, when black will be called black and white will be called white, when at the official level it will be recognized that 2 times 2 is still 4, when a war will be called a war, and a usurper, and when those who kindled and unleashed this war, rather than those who try to stop it, will be recognized as criminals. This day will come, as inevitably as spring follows even the coldest winter, and then our society will open its eyes and be horrified by what terrible crimes were committed on its behalf. From this realization, from this reflection, the long, difficult, but vital path toward the recovery and restoration of Russia, its return to the community of civilized countries, will begin. Even today, even in the darkness surrounding us, even sitting in this cage, I love my country and believe in our people. I believe that we can walk this path. Story 13. Guam, Rota, and Saipan just got slammed directly by a Category 4 hurricane, a super typhoon. We have friends in Rota and Saipan. Haven't been able to reach them. This was a monster storm and it was slow moving, hitting tiny islands. I can't imagine how bad it's going to be. Just waiting for the phone to ring or a text to come through, but I imagine communication is going to be down for a while. Story 14. The Panama Papers. A massive exposure of money laundering around the world. While that itself is newsworthy, the one reporter who refused to stop talking about the incident, Caruana Galizia, was assassinated via car bomb in 2017. Here's another good one. If you want American journalism in a nutshell, look up the incident surrounding the firing of General McChrystal during the U.S. war in Afghanistan. It's hard to find the sources I used when I wrote about this in high school, but the too long didn't read was that a highly controversial reporter named Michael Hastings had exposed the inner workings and opinions of General McChrystal, who was in charge of a good portion of the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. This cost McChrystal his job, partially for good reason, and that should have been the end of it. However, controversy started in the world of journalism surrounding how Hastings went about finding out the information he published. He had McChrystal's trust, and broke that trust by exposing him, whistleblowing somewhat, but also slandering him to an extent. The journalism world was then torn between what interests were more important, the truth or the inside scoop. The side protecting the elites and looking away from time to time for quick access to information won. Story 15. There was an investigation starting about the practices of abusive naked short-selling stocks. Essentially, free money for large market makers and institutions because they were never forced to pay to close out these positions as they could keep rolling them over. They did not own what they were selling because what they sold exceeded what was available to be sold. And then there was a fire in the warehouse where these records are kept. Impeccable timing. Story 16. A company called BlackRock is slowly buying up houses all over the country so they can rent them out to people rather than being able to buy their own house. It's going to help destroy the middle class. They are eventually trying to turn us all into permanent renters. And the thing is, they come in and buy a house for more than the asking price, so the sellers are more likely to sell it to them. In some states, they have bought entire neighborhoods. The middle class is getting gutted in this country. It's a dystopian nightmare. Story 17. Federal government workers data breach. In June 2015, OPM discovered that the background investigation records of current, former, and prospective federal employees and contractors had been stolen. OPM and the Interagency Incident Response Team have concluded with high confidence that sensitive information, including the social security numbers of 21.5 million individuals, was stolen from the background investigation databases. This includes 19.7 million individuals that applied for a background investigation and 1.8 million non-applicants, primarily spouses or cohabitants of applicants. Some records also include findings from interviews conducted by background investigators, and approximately 5.6 million include fingerprints. Usernames and passwords that background investigation applicants used to fill out their background investigation forms were also stolen. While background investigation records do contain some information regarding mental health and financial history provided by applicants and people contacted during the background investigation, there is no evidence that health, financial, payroll, and retirement records of federal personnel or those who have applied for a federal job were impacted by this incident. For example, annuity rolls, retirement records, USA Jobs, Employee Express. Earlier in 2015, OPM discovered that the personnel data of 4.2 million current and former federal government employees had been stolen. This means information such as full name, birth date, home address, and social security numbers were affected. Story 18. The Mormon Church collects $100 billion in tithes that are secretly stashed away in shell companies, and none of it is spent on the communities that collect them. Where are the homeless shelters? Where are the soup kitchens? Any supporting infrastructure available to the general public? Nope. Sorry, City Creek Shopping Mall doesn't count. They claim it's for a rainy day fund and for building temples to perform their necro ordinances to save the dead from death, charging families 10% of their income to participate in these so they can have a pseudo-promise that families can be together forever. But all of this is money in the normal operating expenses of the church, not the billions stashed away in the savings bank. The church based in Utah, USA can and should help improve the communities. Doesn't matter if it's Utah, Missouri, or Kenya in South America. This money should be spent as a charity. If not, it should be taxed so the government can provide services to citizens. Story 19. Wizards of the Coast and their parent company Hasbro sent actual Pinkerton agents to a residential customer over a batch of Magic the Gathering cards that were mistakenly shipped because they were like 3 weeks early. They were likely armed, entered without legal representation, searched and seized products which were purchased through legal means. Also, both Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast think this is perfectly fine and normal. To add to this, in the fall, Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast hatched a plan to update a gaming license from free to use into having royalties sent to them, and it would be retroactive, going back decades. They then went legally after those that discovered the info, and finally, in 2023, it came out to be true. Then, after 2 more attempts to update the license, each time saying the previous was just a draft, despite requiring signed agreements, they made it very public that Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast won, and so did the fans. On top of it all, it's been leaked from inside about the disdain from those higher in management regarding customers, and that customers only exist as a barrier to Hasbro's money. Their attempt to answer questions at a summit with media influencers and well-knowns turned out to be a media display where they had no answers and clearly had not listened to a thing from their customers or distributors in the last year. Oh, and about the Pinkertons. Hasbro's perfectly fine hiring ex-Pinkerton agents in high-ranking loss prevention roles, so they're perfectly fine if things go awry. That's just business. Seriously, this is a toy company that has gone so dystopian mega corporation it borders on satire. Drop Hasbro and their subsidiaries. Story 20. All the anti-privacy laws are popping up everywhere suddenly. The UK's Online Safety Bill, USA's Earn It Act, EU's chat control. They're all being very sneaky about it. The proponents of the bills often outright lying about not targeting encryption, but they all have the same goal: outlaw any tools people can use to prevent governments from spying on them. And nobody's talking about it. Contact your representative and demand they oppose these bills in any way possible. Spread the word. Don't let them rob us of our privacy quietly. The UK is pretty much screwed at this point, but we still have a real chance to stop this in the US and EU, but we have to act. Story 21. There are only 3 states where it's illegal for a fertility doctor to switch chosen sperm with another sample. On many occasions, they have swapped in their own sperm, with some having dozens of children this way. In many places, there is limited regulation on how much sperm an individual can donate. One known serial donor has fathered multiple hundreds of children, and very little can be done to stop him. Laura High is a donor-conceived person advocating for more regulations. Find her on TikTok or via her podcast Insemination if you want to know more. Story 22. In Ohio, householder taking bribes from First Energy. They tried to play it off like that's what lobbyists do. Bullshit. They were straight up bribes. They got convicted, but it just wasn't talked about as much as I thought the biggest conviction of bribery and money laundering in Ohio would have brought. I don't know if First Energy is getting charged with anything. It just seems to have fizzled out. And First Energy will be doubling the cost come June this year. Wonder why? Story 23. Ethiopia and Egypt are in a dispute over the Grand Renaissance Ethiopian Dam, which could escalate into war. It is going to take years to fill the reservoir, during which time flows on the Nile River will be reduced, and the two countries haven't been able to reach an agreement on this filling process. Pray to God that it doesn't stop raining in the Blue Nile Basin. Story 24. Every missing and murdered indigenous girl or woman. They don't even make the news a lot of the time. A recent example of the disaster is Carson McKenzie's suspicious death in Cowichan Bay, British Columbia, Canada. If the general public showed more loud interest in these cases, they might actually make the news and get the attention they deserve. Story 25. Maybe not buried, but that we were told Epstein himself. While on 24/7 surveillance, 2 separate sets of guards fell asleep on duty, and his surveillance camera turned off in the hour time span he himself. How has there been no follow-up on that? Story 26. The Ethiopian civil conflict. Estimated 600,000 people died from 2020 to 2022. And nobody has ever even heard about it. Deadliest conflict of the 21st century thus far, and it's technically still ongoing. Story 27. Anybody see that 60 Minutes episode recently where members of eBay's corporate team stalked and harassed some poor old couple writing a blog that didn't favor the company? Also, that episode on Havana Syndrome where Olivia Troy talked about how she was working on the grounds when she was hit. That shit doesn't get enough attention. Also, one thing rarely talked about is how the LAPD actively recruited white Southerners that served in the military to help police its black and brown neighborhoods. Story 28. The Panama Papers. 11.5 million documents show the myriad of ways in which the rich can exploit secretive offshore tax regimes. 12 national leaders are among 143 politicians, their families, and close associates from around the world known to have been using offshore tax havens.